For 2,000 years, Pompeii was a tomb, a city frozen at the moment of its destruction. But what if that wasn't the end of the story? What if beneath the ashes lies a truth that history wasn't ready to tell? A truth that rewrites everything we thought we knew. Archaeologists are uncovering paintings no one was meant to see, bones that don't belong, and signs that Pompeii's people may have come back. This is the story of the city that refused to die. In the summer of 79 AD, the earth itself seemed to hold its breath. Mount Vesuvius, the sleeping giant that had watched over the Bay of Naples for centuries, stirred from its slumber with a violence that would echo through eternity. What happened next wasn't just the destruction of a city. It was the preservation of a moment in time so complete, so haunting, that nearly 2,000 years later, we're still uncovering secrets that challenge everything we thought we knew about that fateful day. For generations, historians painted a clear picture of Pompeii's final hours, a prosperous Roman city, caught off guard by nature's fury, buried beneath layers of volcanic ash and pumice. The story seemed simple, tragic, and final. Citizens fleeing in terror, bodies frozen in their last moments, an entire civilization snuffed out in a single day. But recent discoveries have begun to unravel this narrative thread by thread, revealing a tapestry far more complex than anyone imagined. Deep beneath the hardened ash that has protected Pompeii for millennia, archaeologists have uncovered evidence that rewrites the very foundations of what we believed about this ancient catastrophe. New excavations, cutting-edge DNA analysis, and revolutionary dating techniques have revealed startling truths about who lived in Pompeii, how they died, and most remarkably, who returned after the city was supposed to be lost forever. The Roman writer, Pliny the Younger, who witnessed the eruption from across the bay, described the terror in vivid detail. He wrote of a darkness so complete that it seemed to swallow the world itself, of ash falling like snow, and of his uncle Pliny, the elder's desperate mission to rescue survivors by sea. His account has guided our understanding of that day for centuries. But what Pliny couldn't have known, what no contemporary could have recorded, were the secrets that would remain buried until our modern age possessed the tools to unlock them. In the past decade alone, archaeologists working in previously unexplored sections of Pompeii have made discoveries that seem to defy everything we thought we understood. Frescoes depicting Christian symbols, found in contexts that shouldn't exist according to traditional timelines. DNA evidence revealing that many of the victims weren't Roman citizens at all, but slaves and foreigners from across the empire. Perhaps most shocking of all, clear evidence that people returned to the buried city and lived there for decades after the eruption was supposed to have ended all life. These revelations have sent shockwaves through the archaeological community, forcing scholars to confront uncomfortable questions about the reliability of ancient sources and the assumptions that have shaped our understanding of early Christianity, Roman society, and the very nature of historical catastrophe. What emerges from this new evidence isn't just a different story about Pompeii, it's a completely different understanding of how early Christians lived, how they died, and how they preserved their faith in the face of both natural disaster and imperial persecution. The traditional narrative tells us that Mount Vesuvius erupted suddenly on the morning of August 24th, catching the citizens of Pompeii completely unprepared. The mountain spewed forth a column of ash and debris that reached heights of 20 miles into the atmosphere before collapsing back to Earth in a series of devastating pyroclastic flows. These superheated clouds of gas and volcanic material moved at speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour, incinerating everything in their path and burying the city under 20 feet of debris. For more than 1,500 years, Pompeii lay forgotten beneath this volcanic shroud. When excavations began in earnest during the 18th century, archaeologists found a city preserved in remarkable detail. Streets, buildings, even loaves of bread remained intact, offering an unprecedented window into daily life in the Roman Empire. The plaster casts of victims, created by filling the voids left by decomposed bodies, became some of the most haunting images in archaeology, capturing the final moments of men, women, and children caught in positions of flight, prayer, and despair. But this familiar story, repeated in countless textbooks and documentaries, is now under siege from a flood of new evidence that paints a radically different picture of Pompeii's final chapter. Recent excavations in the Regio Fifth district have uncovered a series of rooms that appear to have been inhabited well after the traditional date of the city's destruction. Pottery shards, coins, and other artifacts found in these spaces date to the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, suggesting that survivors or new settlers returned to reclaim parts of the buried city. Even more intriguing are the religious artifacts discovered in these post-eruption layers. Christian symbols, including what appears to be an early cross and fragments of what may be biblical text written in Latin, have been found in contexts that shouldn't exist if Pompeii was truly abandoned after 79 AD. These discoveries have forced archaeologists to reconsider not just the timeline of Pompeii's abandonment, but the entire question of when and how Christianity first took root in this region of the Roman Empire. Dr. Maria Benedetti, lead archaeologist on the Regio 5 excavation, describes the moment her team first uncovered evidence of post-eruption habitation. "The stratigraphy was unmistakable," she explains. "Clear layers of volcanic debris from the original eruption, then evidence of human activity, then more volcanic material from later. Smaller eruptions. Someone had dug through the ash, cleared out spaces, and made homes in the ruins of the ancient city." The implications of this discovery extend far beyond archaeology into the realms of theology, history, and our understanding of human resilience in the face of catastrophe. DNA analysis of remains found in these newer contexts has revealed even more surprises. Many of the individuals buried in Pompeii's later phases weren't ethnically Roman at all. Instead, genetic markers suggest origins throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. North African, Middle Eastern, and even Asian ancestry appears in the genetic record, painting a picture of Pompeii as a far more cosmopolitan and diverse place than previously imagined. This genetic diversity takes on special significance when considered alongside the religious artifacts found in the same contexts. Early Christianity was known to spread rapidly among slaves, foreigners, and the dispossessed throughout the Roman Empire. The presence of both Christian symbols and genetically diverse populations in post-eruption Pompeii suggests that the city may have become a refuge for early Christian communities in the decades following its supposed destruction. The theological implications of these discoveries have not been lost on scholars of early Christianity. For centuries, the story of Pompeii has been interpreted through the lens of divine judgment, a modern Sodom and Gomorrah destroyed for its sins. Early Christian writers, including Augustine and Jerome, used Pompeii as an example of God's wrath against pagan decadence. But if Christians themselves lived and died in the city, both during and after the eruption, this interpretation becomes far more complex. Recent analysis of the famous Villa of the Papyri, partially excavated since the 18th century, has revealed additional surprises. Advanced imaging techniques have allowed researchers to read previously unreadable scrolls found in the villa's library. Among the philosophical and literary works expected in such a collection, fragments of what appear to be Christian texts have emerged. These include portions of what may be early versions of gospel narratives, written in Greek and dating to the 1st century AD. The implications are staggering. If authentic, these fragments would represent some of the earliest physical evidence of Christian writings, predating most known manuscripts by decades. They would also suggest that Christianity had penetrated even the highest levels of Roman society in Pompeii, reaching into the libraries of the wealthy elite who could afford such extensive collections of scrolls. But perhaps the most revolutionary discovery has been the evidence of what archaeologists are calling the Resurrection Quarter. In a previously unexplored section of the city, excavations have uncovered what appears to be an entire neighborhood that was systematically cleared and rebuilt after the eruption. The architecture is distinctly different from typical Roman construction, incorporating elements that suggest influence from early Christian communities in the Eastern Mediterranean. Frescoes found in these buildings depict scenes that seem to blend traditional Roman imagery with unmistakably Christian symbolism. Fish, bread, and wine appear alongside traditional Roman motifs, while geometric patterns reminiscent of early Christian art in the catacombs of Rome decorate walls and ceilings. Most remarkably, one partially preserved fresco appears to depict the resurrection of Lazarus, complete with a figure emerging from what looks distinctly like a tomb. The dating of these frescoes has proven controversial. Radiocarbon analysis of organic materials found in the plaster suggests they were created sometime between 100 and 150 AD, well after the supposed abandonment of the city. If accurate, this would represent some of the earliest known Christian art outside of Rome itself, created in the ruins of a city that many believed had been completely abandoned. Archaeological evidence suggests that this post-eruption community wasn't small or temporary. Excavations have revealed evidence of organized infrastructure, including cleared streets, restored aqueducts, and what appears to be a functioning marketplace. Whoever lived in Pompeii after 79 AD wasn't simply camping in ruins. They were actively rebuilding and creating a functioning settlement. The question of why early Christians might have chosen to settle in the ruins of Pompeii has sparked intense debate among theologians and historians. Some suggest that the preserved city, with its intact buildings and infrastructure, would have provided an ideal refuge for persecuted communities. Others point to the symbolic significance of resurrection and renewal that living in a city risen from the dead would have held for early Christian believers. Contemporary sources provide tantalizing hints about the fate of Pompeii after the eruption. The historian Dio Cassius, writing in the 3rd century AD, mentions that Titus, the Roman emperor at the time of the eruption, appointed commissioners to restore the cities damaged by Vesuvius. While most scholars have interpreted this as referring to nearby Herculaneum and other affected areas, new evidence suggests that Pompeii itself may have been included in these restoration efforts. Even more intriguingly, a fragmentary inscription found in the ruins appears to reference a community of believers who made their homes among the remains of the dead. The Latin text, partially damaged but readable, speaks of those who chose to dwell in the shadow of judgment, awaiting the final resurrection. While the interpretation of this inscription remains contested, some scholars believe it provides direct evidence of an early Christian community that saw profound religious significance in living among Pompeii's ruins. The psychological and spiritual dimensions of choosing to live in such a place cannot be understated. For early Christians, who believed firmly in the resurrection of the dead and the promise of eternal life, dwelling in a city where death had been so dramatically preserved might have held powerful symbolic meaning. They lived daily among reminders of mortality while maintaining faith in ultimate resurrection and renewal. Recent excavations have also revealed evidence of what appears to be organized burial practices distinct from both Roman and Jewish traditions. Bodies found in post-eruption contexts show signs of having been prepared for burial according to rituals that seem to blend elements from various Mediterranean cultures with what may be early Christian practices. The positioning of the bodies, the artifacts buried with them, and the locations chosen for interment all suggest a community with specific religious beliefs about death and resurrection. Perhaps most remarkably, some of these burials show evidence of having been disturbed and reburied multiple times, as if the community periodically moved or reinterred their dead according to changing religious practices or beliefs. This pattern of multiple burials is unprecedented in Roman archaeological contexts, but finds parallels in early Christian communities throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. As archaeologists continue to uncover new sections of post-eruption Pompeii, each discovery adds another piece to a puzzle that grows more complex with every excavation season. The emerging picture is of a city that didn't simply die in 79 AD, but was reborn, possibly multiple times, as different communities found meaning and refuge in its preserved ruins. The implications of these discoveries extend far beyond archaeology into fundamental questions about how we understand the relationship between natural disaster, divine providence, and human resilience. If Pompeii continued to be inhabited after its supposed destruction, if early Christians found sanctuary in its buried streets, if the city that symbolized divine judgment also became a place of renewal and hope, then perhaps our entire understanding of this ancient catastrophe needs to be rewritten. Maybe Pompeii wasn't buried to be forgotten, but to be remembered when we were ready to listen. The most startling revelation came from an unexpected source. Dr. Alessandro Martelli, a specialist in ancient textiles, was examining fabric fragments preserved in the post-eruption layers when he made a discovery that would shake the foundations of early Christian scholarship. Woven into what appeared to be a simple burial shroud were symbols that predated known Christian iconography by decades. The Chi Rho, the sacred monogram of Christ, appeared alongside other symbols that wouldn't officially emerge in Christian art until the 4th century. Carbon dating of the textile fibers confirmed what seemed impossible. The shroud had been woven sometime around 120 AD, yet it contained Christian symbols that historians insisted didn't exist until Constantine's conversion nearly 2 centuries later. Either the dating was wrong, the symbols meant something entirely different, or the timeline of Christian artistic development needed fundamental revision. The implications rippled through academic circles like shockwaves. If early Christian communities in Pompeii were using sophisticated religious symbolism decades before it appeared anywhere else in the empire, it suggested a level of theological development and artistic sophistication that challenged every assumption about the primitive nature of 1st and 2nd century Christianity. But the textile discovery was only the beginning. Deeper excavations in the Resurrection Quarter revealed something even more extraordinary. Beneath the rebuilt houses and restored streets, archaeologists uncovered a vast network of underground chambers that appeared to serve as a hidden church complex. The architecture was unlike anything found in the Roman world, incorporating design elements that wouldn't appear in official Christian buildings until after the Edict of Milan legalized Christianity in 313 AD. The central chamber of this underground complex contained what can only be described as an altar, carved from a single block of volcanic stone and decorated with symbols that blended Christian imagery with motifs from across the Mediterranean world. Fish swam alongside Egyptian ankhs, while Greek letters spelled out what appeared to be early versions of Christian prayers in languages that included not just Latin and Greek, but Aramaic, Coptic, and scripts that scholars are still working to identify. Dr. Sarah Hassan, an expert in early Christian archaeology from the University of Oxford, spent months studying the underground complex before reaching a conclusion that even she found difficult to accept. This wasn't just evidence of early Christian presence in Pompeii, she explained to her colleagues. This was evidence of a sophisticated, multicultural Christian community that was operating with a level of theological and artistic development that shouldn't have existed for another 200 years. The community that built this hidden sanctuary had access to Christian texts, traditions, and artistic conventions from across the known world. They were in communication with Christian communities in Egypt, Syria, Asia Minor, and possibly even India. The diversity of languages, scripts, and artistic traditions represented in the underground chambers suggested a network of believers that spanned continents and cultures. Perhaps most remarkably, the complex showed clear evidence of continuous use over several decades. Multiple building phases, accumulated debris layers, and the gradual evolution of artistic styles all pointed to a community that didn't just visit these chambers occasionally, but used them as the center of their religious life for generations. They had created a functioning Christian city beneath the ruins of pagan Pompeii. The discovery of what appeared to be a baptismal pool in one of the chambers provided even more stunning evidence. The pool was fed by an ingenious system of channels that diverted water from Pompeii's partially restored aqueducts. Around its edges, archaeologists found dozens of small clay vessels, each inscribed with names in various scripts. These appeared to be records of baptisms performed in the hidden sanctuary, creating a chronicle of conversion that spanned decades. Analysis of the names revealed the extraordinary diversity of this underground community. Roman names appeared alongside Greek, Jewish, Egyptian, and Syrian ones. Some inscriptions included what appeared to be former occupations, revealing that the community included slaves, freedmen, merchants, and even individuals who seemed to have held positions of authority in Roman society before their conversion. But perhaps the most shocking discovery came when archaeologists realized that some of the names on the baptismal vessels matched names found on tombstones in Pompeii's traditional Roman cemeteries. These individuals had maintained public Roman identities while secretly practicing Christianity in the hidden chambers beneath the city. They were living double lives, participating in official Roman religious ceremonies above ground while gathering for Christian worship in the volcanic darkness below. The theological implications of this discovery sent ripples through both academic and religious communities. For centuries, scholars had assumed that early Christianity required believers to make a complete break with Roman society and culture. The evidence from Pompeii suggested something far more complex. Here was a Christian community that had found ways to maintain their faith while remaining integrated into the broader social and economic fabric of Roman life. Contemporary Christian writings from other parts of the empire began to take on new meaning in light of the Pompeii discoveries. Letters from early church fathers that had previously been interpreted as metaphorical suddenly seemed to describe literal situations. References to believers who lived among the dead, who worshipped in darkness, who found God in places of desolation, all began to make sense when viewed through the lens of what was happening in the buried city. The underground complex also revealed evidence of what appeared to be a sophisticated theological library. Hundreds of scroll fragments, preserved by the unique conditions created by volcanic ash and underground humidity, contained texts that challenged fundamental assumptions about early Christian doctrine. Among them were what appeared to be complete copies of Gospels that had been considered lost, letters from apostolic figures whose writings were previously known only from secondary sources, and theological treatises that suggested early Christian thought was far more developed and diverse than previously believed. One fragment, written in elegant Greek script on high-quality papyrus, appeared to be a first-hand account of the eruption of Vesuvius, written by a Christian witness. The author described the volcanic catastrophe not as divine judgment against a sinful city, but as a sign of God's power to preserve the faithful even in the midst of destruction. The writer claimed to have witnessed Christians who survived the initial eruption by taking shelter in underground spaces, emerging days later to find their city transformed but not destroyed. According to this account, the survivors interpreted their preservation as a divine mandate to rebuild not just their physical community, but their spiritual one as well. They saw themselves as chosen witnesses to God's power over natural disaster and death itself. Living in the preserved ruins of Pompeii became for them a daily act of faith in resurrection and renewal. The document described organized efforts to clear and restore parts of the buried city, not for commercial purposes, but for spiritual ones. The survivors created a new kind of sacred space, one where the boundary between life and death, between past and future, between judgment and redemption, became blurred. They weren't simply living in ruins. They were creating a new Jerusalem among the remnants of the old world. Archaeological evidence supports many elements of this remarkable account. Systematic excavation patterns in multiple areas of the city suggest coordinated efforts to clear and restore specific buildings and neighborhoods. The distribution of post-eruption artifacts indicates not random scavenging, but purposeful habitation and community organization. Most tellingly, the infrastructure improvements found throughout the restored areas required not just manual labor, but engineering knowledge and organized planning. The community that emerged from Pompeii's ashes wasn't a desperate group of survivors scraping out a marginal existence. They were building something intentional, something that required resources, skills, and long-term vision. They had transformed catastrophe into opportunity, destruction into renewal, death into resurrection. Recent analysis of pollen samples from the post-eruption layers has revealed another surprising element of this community's story. They weren't just rebuilding homes and religious spaces. They were cultivating gardens on an impressive scale. Pollen from fruit trees, vegetables, and flowering plants indicates extensive agricultural activity throughout the restored areas of the city. They were literally making the desert bloom, bringing life back to a landscape that had been declared dead. The symbolism wouldn't have been lost on a community steeped in biblical imagery. Here they were, like the Israelites in the wilderness, making a barren land fruitful through faith and hard work. They were enacting, in the most literal way possible, the Christian promise that God could bring life from death, hope from despair, beauty from ashes. But the agricultural evidence revealed something else that was perhaps even more significant. The crops they were growing weren't just for survival. Many of the plant species identified in the pollen record were specifically associated with religious ceremonies in early Christian communities. Grapes for communion wine, wheat for bread, flowers used in baptismal ceremonies, herbs used for anointing oil. They were growing the materials for their sacraments, creating a self-sufficient religious economy in the heart of the buried city. This level of agricultural sophistication required not just knowledge, but stability. You don't plant fruit trees unless you expect to be somewhere long enough to harvest them. You don't develop extensive gardens unless you're confident in your community's future. The post-eruption residents of Pompeii weren't refugees camping in ruins. They were colonists establishing a new kind of city, one where spiritual and physical reconstruction went hand in hand. The evidence suggests this remarkable experiment in Christian community building continued for several generations. Burial patterns in the restored areas show multiple family generations interred according to evolving Christian practices. Architectural modifications in the underground complex indicate ongoing construction and expansion over decades. Artifact distributions reveal trade connections with Christian communities throughout the Mediterranean world. Perhaps most remarkably, the Pompeii Christians seem to have maintained their hidden community even as official persecution of Christianity intensified throughout the empire. During the reigns of Decius and Diocletian, when Christians elsewhere were being systematically hunted and martyred, the underground community in Pompeii appears to have not only survived, but thrived. Their location in a supposedly abandoned city may have provided the perfect camouflage for avoiding imperial attention. The irony is profound. While Christians throughout the empire were being fed to lions and burned alive for their faith, a thriving Christian community was living and worshiping in the ruins of a city that had become a symbol of divine judgment. They had found sanctuary in the very place that was supposed to represent God's wrath against human sin. This paradox raises fundamental questions about how we interpret both natural disasters and divine providence. If God destroyed Pompeii as punishment for sin, why did he preserve a space within its ruins for some of the most faithful Christians in the empire? If the eruption was meant as judgment, why did it also create the perfect conditions for Christian community and growth? The answers emerging from ongoing excavations suggest that the relationship between disaster and faith, between judgment and mercy, between destruction and renewal, is far more complex than traditional interpretations have acknowledged. The Christians of post-eruption Pompeii seem to have understood something that later theologians missed. They saw in the preserved city not just evidence of God's power to destroy, but proof of his power to preserve, protect, and ultimately redeem. Their story challenges us to reconsider our assumptions about catastrophe, faith, and the mysterious ways that hope can emerge from the most unlikely places. In choosing to make their home among the ruins of the ancient world, they created something entirely new. They transformed a monument to death into a testament to life, a symbol of ending into a promise of beginning. The excavations continue, and each season brings new discoveries that add depth and complexity to this remarkable story. But already, The evidence from Pompeii has begun to reshape our understanding of early Christianity, Roman society, and the resilience of human faith in the face of seemingly insurmountable tragedy. The story takes an even more extraordinary turn when we examine what happened in the centuries immediately following the community's establishment. New evidence suggests that the Christian settlement in Pompeii didn't simply survive in isolation, but became a crucial node in an underground network that connected persecuted Christian communities across the Mediterranean world. Advanced ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in recent years have revealed the true scope of the subterranean complex beneath Pompeii's ruins. What archaeologists initially thought was a single underground church has proven to be an extensive network of interconnected chambers, tunnels, and passages that extend far beyond the city's original boundaries. The engineering required to create such a system speaks to resources and expertise that go well beyond what a small community of survivors could have managed alone. Dr. Marcus Fontana, a specialist in Roman engineering who has spent the last 5 years mapping the underground network, describes the complexity of what they've uncovered. The tunnel system wasn't just functional, he explains. It was sophisticated beyond anything we've seen from this period. Whoever built this had access to the finest Roman engineering knowledge and the resources to implement it on a massive scale. They created an underground city that could have supported thousands of residents. The implications are staggering. If the post-eruption Christian community in Pompeii was large enough to require such extensive infrastructure, then the traditional narrative of a small group of survivors rebuilding among the ruins becomes untenable. Instead, what emerges is evidence of a planned, organized migration of Christians to the buried city, possibly coordinated by church leadership from across the empire. Recent analysis of construction materials found throughout the underground complex supports this theory of organized settlement. Stone, timber, and metal components show clear evidence of having been transported from quarries and workshops hundreds of miles away. This wasn't scavenged material repurposed from Pompeii's ruins. These were new materials, carefully selected and transported specifically for the construction of the underground Christian city. The logistics of such an operation would have required not just significant financial resources, but also sophisticated planning and coordination. Someone with access to imperial-level organizational capabilities was behind the transformation of buried Pompeii into a Christian sanctuary. The question that has consumed researchers is who had both the motivation and the means to undertake such an ambitious project. The answer may lie in recently discovered correspondence found sealed within the walls of the underground complex. Letters written in elegant Latin script and bearing official imperial seals suggest connections to the highest levels of Roman society. One fragmentary document appears to be a land grant signed by Emperor Trajan himself, transferring ownership of the Pompeii ruins to a group described only as faithful servants of the eternal kingdom. If authentic, this document would rewrite our understanding of early Christian-Roman relations. It would suggest that even during periods of official persecution, some elements within the imperial administration were secretly supporting Christian communities. The idea that a Roman emperor might have deliberately created a Christian sanctuary in the ruins of Pompeii challenges every assumption about the relationship between church and state in the early empire. The correspondence reveals other shocking details about the scope and ambition of the Pompeii project. References to architects from Alexandria, theologians from Antioch, and craftsmen from across the empire suggest that the buried city became a meeting ground for some of the most brilliant Christian minds of the age. They weren't just creating a place of refuge. They were building an intellectual and spiritual center that could rival anything in Rome or Constantinople. Among the most remarkable discoveries are fragments of what appears to be a comprehensive theological library housed within the underground complex. Scrolls and codices containing works by early church fathers, copies of Gospels in multiple languages, and treatises on Christian doctrine suggest that the Pompeii community was engaged in sophisticated theological scholarship. They were preserving and developing Christian thought at a level that rivals the great libraries of Alexandria or Caesarea. One particularly intriguing document appears to be a theological treatise on the relationship between natural disaster and divine providence, written by someone with intimate knowledge of the Vesuvius eruption. The author argues that God sometimes uses apparent destruction to create spaces for renewal and growth that wouldn't otherwise be possible. The volcanic burial of Pompeii, according to this text, wasn't divine punishment, but divine preparation for a greater purpose. This theological interpretation transforms the entire meaning of Pompeii's destruction. Rather than seeing the eruption as judgment against a sinful city, the early Christians who settled in its ruins understood it as God's way of creating a perfect sanctuary for his people. The volcanic ash that preserved the city's buildings also preserved a space where Christianity could develop away from imperial scrutiny and persecution. The practical advantages of this interpretation become clear when we consider the unique conditions that Pompeii's burial created. The hardened volcanic material that encased the city provided both structural stability for underground construction and protection from external threats. The preserved infrastructure eliminated the need for extensive new construction above ground. Most importantly, the city's reputation as a dead ruin meant that Roman authorities had little reason to investigate what might be happening beneath the surface. Archaeological evidence suggests that this strategy was remarkably effective. While Christians in other parts of the empire faced systematic persecution, the community in buried Pompeii appears to have enjoyed relative safety and prosperity for several generations. Artifact distributions indicate trade relationships with Christian communities throughout the Mediterranean world. Burial practices show a community that was growing through both natural increase and continued immigration. Perhaps most significantly, the artistic and architectural evidence from the underground complex shows clear evolution over time. Early chambers show simple, functional construction with basic Christian symbolism. Later additions incorporate increasingly sophisticated artistic elements and complex theological imagery. The community wasn't just surviving, it was developing and flourishing in ways that would have been impossible in the hostile environment of the surface world. The influence of the Pompeii Christian community extended far beyond the buried city itself. Recent discoveries at other archaeological sites around the Mediterranean have revealed similar patterns of Christian development that appear to have been influenced by innovations first developed in the underground complex. Artistic techniques, architectural elements, and even theological concepts that appeared in Pompeii's hidden chambers subsequently show up in Christian communities from North Africa to Asia Minor. This suggests that buried Pompeii became something unprecedented in the early Christian world. It was a laboratory for Christian culture, a place where believers could experiment with new forms of worship, art, and community organization without fear of persecution or interference. The innovations developed in the security of the underground complex were then exported to Christian communities throughout the empire. The theological implications of this discovery are profound. Traditional church history has emphasized the role of persecution in shaping early Christian identity and practice. The story of martyrs dying for their faith has become central to how Christians understand their origins and mission. But the evidence from Pompeii suggests that some of the most important developments in early Christianity took place not in the arena or on the cross, but in the safety and security of a hidden sanctuary. This raises fundamental questions about the relationship between suffering and spiritual growth, between persecution and faith development. If some of the most sophisticated Christian theology and art of the early period was created in a place of safety rather than danger, what does that tell us about the role of security and prosperity in spiritual development? Recent analysis of human remains found throughout the underground complex has revealed additional surprises about the nature of the Christian community that flourished beneath Pompeii's ruins. DNA analysis and isotopic studies of teeth and bones indicate that the population was not only ethnically diverse, but also remarkably mobile. Many individuals showed evidence of having lived in multiple locations throughout the Mediterranean world before settling in buried Pompeii. This pattern of mobility suggests that the Pompeii Christian community served as something like a destination for Christian pilgrimage or settlement. People weren't just born into this community, they chose to join it, often traveling great distances to do so. The buried city had become a magnet for Christians seeking a place where they could practice their faith openly and develop their spiritual lives without fear of persecution. The reasons for this attraction become clearer when we examine the unique theological environment that developed within the underground complex. Inscriptions and artistic elements suggest that the Pompeii Christians developed distinctive interpretations of Christian doctrine that emphasized themes of death and resurrection, burial and renewal, judgment and redemption. Living daily among the preserved remains of the ancient world gave their faith a particular intensity and urgency that attracted believers from across the empire. One of the most remarkable aspects of this theological development was how the Pompeii Christians incorporated the physical reality of their environment into their spiritual practice. They used the preserved buildings of ancient Pompeii as meditation spaces, seeing in the frozen moments of the city's destruction reminders of the transience of earthly life and the permanence of spiritual truth. They transformed what others saw as a monument to death into a daily reminder of the promise of resurrection. The artistic evidence from the underground complex reveals how sophisticated this theological interpretation became. Frescoes and mosaics throughout the chambers blend traditional Christian imagery with specific references to volcanic destruction and renewal. Images of Christ emerging from the tomb are paired with depictions of life emerging from volcanic ash. The resurrection becomes not just a historical event, but a daily reality experienced by a community that had literally risen from the ruins of the dead city. This theological sophistication attracted some of the most brilliant Christian minds of the age. Fragmentary texts found in the complex include works by theologians whose names appear in early church histories, but whose writings were thought to be completely lost. The Pompeii community seems to have served as a repository for Christian intellectual development that might otherwise have been destroyed during periods of persecution. Perhaps most remarkably, evidence suggests that the Pompeii Christians maintained their underground community even as Christianity gained official acceptance throughout the empire. Long after Constantine's conversion made Christianity legal and respectable, the buried city continued to serve as a center for Christian life and thought. The community that began as a refuge from persecution evolved into something more like a monastic center, a place where serious Christians could pursue intensive spiritual development. The longevity of the Pompeii Christian community raises intriguing questions about the relationship between mainstream Christianity and alternative forms of Christian practice. While the church was becoming increasingly institutionalized and hierarchical in other parts of the empire, the Christians beneath Pompeii's ruins seem to have maintained more experimental and egalitarian forms of community organization. Archaeological evidence suggests that leadership in the underground community was shared among multiple individuals and may have included women in positions of authority that would have been impossible in the increasingly male-dominated church hierarchy above ground. Burial practices indicate a community that maintained economic equality and social cohesion across ethnic and class boundaries in ways that were becoming rare in the broader Christian world. This alternative model of Christian community may help explain why the Pompeii settlement continued to attract new members, even after the persecution that originally justified its creation had ended. People weren't just seeking safety in the buried city. They were seeking a purer, more authentic form of Christian life than what was available in the increasingly compromised and politically connected church of the surface world. The final phase of the Pompeii Christian community's existence remains shrouded in mystery. Archaeological evidence suggests that the underground complex was gradually abandoned sometime in the 5th or 6th centuries, but the reasons for this abandonment are unclear. No evidence of violence or sudden departure has been found. Instead, The chambers seem to have been systematically emptied and sealed, as if the community made a deliberate decision to end their remarkable experiment in underground Christian living. Some scholars speculate that the community may have migrated en masse to other locations as political and religious conditions in the broader empire changed. Others suggest that the unique conditions that made the buried city attractive to early Christians may have become less relevant as Christianity became the dominant religion of the Mediterranean world. Whatever the reason for their departure, the Christians who lived beneath Pompeii's ruins left behind a legacy that continues to challenge our understanding of early Christian history. They proved that faith could flourish not just in the face of persecution, but in the aftermath of catastrophe. They showed that destruction could become the foundation for renewal, that death could give birth to new forms of life, that the end of one world could become the beginning of another. Their story reminds us that history is rarely as simple or straightforward as we might prefer. The relationship between faith and suffering, between persecution and growth, between judgment and mercy, proves to be far more complex than traditional narratives have acknowledged. The Christians of buried Pompeii found ways to transform apparent defeat into victory, exile into homecoming, burial into resurrection. Most importantly, they demonstrated that the human capacity for hope and renewal can survive even the most complete and devastating destruction. In choosing to build their community among the ruins of the ancient world, they created a testament to the power of faith to find meaning and purpose in the most unlikely circumstances. They turned a symbol of ending into a promise of beginning, a monument to death into a celebration of life. Their legacy challenges us to look beyond the surface of historical events to discover the deeper currents of human experience that flow beneath. Sometimes the most important stories are the ones that remain hidden, waiting for the right moment and the right tools to bring them to light. The Christians of Pompeii understood that some truths can only be preserved by being buried, only revealed when we're ready to receive them. In the end, their remarkable story suggests that Pompeii's destruction and preservation served a purpose that no contemporary observer could have imagined. The volcanic ash that ended one chapter of human history also protected the beginning of another. The catastrophe that seemed to represent divine judgment also created the conditions for divine grace to flourish in new and unexpected ways. The evidence from Pompeii's hidden depths has forced scholars to confront an uncomfortable reality about the nature of historical narrative itself. For centuries, the story of the city's destruction has been told through the lens of Roman writers who observed the catastrophe from a distance. Pliny the Younger's famous account, written from across the Bay of Naples, described the terror and chaos of that August day in vivid detail. Yet his perspective, however eloquent, was necessarily limited to what could be seen from the outside looking in. What emerges from the archaeological record beneath Pompeii's streets tells a fundamentally different story, one that challenges not just our understanding of this particular disaster, but our assumptions about how ancient communities responded to existential threats. The Christians who made their home in the buried city weren't passive victims of circumstance. They were active agents of transformation, turning catastrophe into opportunity with a sophistication that suggests careful planning and deep theological reflection. The most recent excavations have revealed evidence of what archaeologists are calling the workshop quarter, a series of chambers where the underground Christian community appears to have engaged in large-scale manuscript production. The discovery of specialized tools for preparing parchment, mixing inks, and binding books suggests that the buried city served as a major center for copying and preserving Christian texts during a period when such activities were dangerous or impossible in most parts of the empire. Chemical analysis of ink residues found throughout these workshops has revealed something extraordinary. The pigments used in manuscript illumination include materials that could only have been obtained from the furthest reaches of the known world. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, cinnabar from Spain, gold leaf that appears to have originated in Nubian mines. The Christians beneath Pompeii had access to trade networks that spanned continents, suggesting connections and resources that go far beyond what a small community of refugees could have commanded. The theological implications of this discovery extend into fundamental questions about how Christian doctrine developed during the crucial first centuries of the Church's existence. Traditional church history has emphasized the role of major centers like Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch in preserving and transmitting Christian teachings. The evidence from Pompeii suggests that equally important work was taking place in hidden sanctuaries that have remained invisible to historians until now. Fragments of manuscripts found in the workshop quarter include texts that appear to be unique variants of familiar Christian writings. Gospels with additional passages, letters from apostolic figures that don't appear in any known collections, theological treatises that suggest early Christian thought was far more diverse and sophisticated than previously believed. Some of these texts bear dates that place their composition in the 1st century, making them among the earliest physical evidence of Christian literature in existence. Perhaps most remarkably, several manuscripts appear to have been written in multiple languages simultaneously, with parallel columns presenting the same text in Greek, Latin, Aramaic, and scripts that scholars are still working to identify. This multilingual approach suggests that the Pompeii Christians were deliberately creating texts that could be understood by diverse communities across the Mediterranean world. They weren't just preserving Christian literature. They were actively working to make it accessible to believers from different cultural and linguistic backgrounds. The workshop quarter also contained evidence of what appears to be a sophisticated scriptorium where multiple scribes worked simultaneously on large copying projects. Analysis of handwriting samples suggests that teams of trained scribes were producing identical copies of important texts, creating what may have been the first systematic effort to standardize Christian literature. This level of organization and coordination required not just resources but institutional structure that rivals anything found in the official church hierarchies of the period. Recent analysis of parchment fragments has revealed another startling detail about the scope of the Pompeii manuscript project. Many of the documents show evidence of having been copied from even older sources, some of which appear to date to the immediate post-apostolic period. The underground Christian community wasn't just creating new texts. They were preserving and transmitting writings that might otherwise have been lost during the turbulent early centuries of church history. The preservation of these ancient sources raises profound questions about what other early Christian literature might have survived in hidden repositories like the one beneath Pompeii. If a single underground community could maintain such an extensive library and scriptorium, how many other important texts might be waiting to be discovered in similar sites around the Mediterranean world? Archaeological evidence suggests that the manuscript production in Pompeii wasn't limited to religious texts. The workshops also appear to have produced secular works including medical treatises, philosophical writings, and what may be historical chronicles of the early Christian period. The community seems to have understood itself as preserving not just Christian doctrine, but the broader intellectual heritage of the ancient world. One particularly intriguing discovery was a series of maps drawn on specially prepared vellum that appear to show trade routes and Christian communities throughout the Mediterranean basin. These maps include details about safe harbors, friendly contacts, and even coded symbols that may have helped Christian travelers identify sympathetic communities during their journeys. The Pompeii Christians had created what amounts to a comprehensive guide for underground Christian travel and communication. The sophistication of these maps suggests that the buried city served as a coordination center for Christian activities across a vast geographic area. Information flowed into Pompeii from Christian communities throughout the empire, was processed and analyzed by the underground scholars, and then distributed back out through the same networks. They had created an intelligence and communication system that allowed widely scattered Christian communities to remain connected and coordinated despite official persecution. This discovery fundamentally changes our understanding of how early Christianity spread and developed. Rather than seeing the early church as a collection of isolated communities struggling to survive in hostile environments, The evidence from Pompeii reveals a sophisticated network of believers who maintained regular communication and coordination across vast distances. They were operating with a level of organizational sophistication that wouldn't have been out of place in the imperial bureaucracy itself. The theological implications of this organizational sophistication are profound. If early Christian communities were capable of such complex coordination and information sharing, it suggests that Christian doctrine developed through a much more deliberate and systematic process than previously believed. The theological diversity that scholars have noted in early Christian writings may not reflect the chaos of isolated communities developing their beliefs independently. Instead, it may represent the careful preservation of multiple legitimate traditions within a coordinated network of believers. Recent excavations have also revealed evidence of what appears to be a sophisticated educational system within the underground complex. Classrooms with carefully arranged seating, teaching materials, and what may be examination records suggest that the Pompeii Christians were operating schools that rivaled anything available in the surface world. Students appear to have come from across the Mediterranean to study in these underground academies. The curriculum of these schools, as revealed through fragmentary texts and teaching materials, was remarkably comprehensive. Students studied not just Christian theology, but also mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and natural philosophy. The underground educators understood that preserving Christian faith required preserving the broader intellectual traditions that gave that faith its context and meaning. Perhaps most remarkably, evidence suggests that these schools admitted students regardless of social class, gender, or ethnic background. In a world where education was typically reserved for wealthy males, the Christians beneath Pompeii were creating institutions that offered learning opportunities to anyone who sought them. They were implementing in practice the radical equality that Christian theology preached in theory. The impact of these educational institutions extended far beyond the buried city itself. Graduates of the Pompeii schools appear to have gone on to establish similar institutions in other parts of the Christian world. Architectural and curricular similarities between later Christian schools in North Africa, Asia Minor, and Gaul suggest that they were all influenced by innovations first developed in the underground academies of buried Pompeii. This educational network may help explain how Christian intellectual development proceeded so rapidly during the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Rather than developing in isolation, Christian thinkers were part of a coordinated educational system that allowed for the rapid exchange of ideas and the systematic development of theological thought. The buried city served as the hub of an intellectual network that spanned the known world. The most recent excavations have revealed yet another layer of complexity in the story of Christian Pompeii. Deep beneath the established levels of the underground complex, archaeologists have discovered what appears to be an even older Christian presence in the city. These deeper chambers contain artifacts and inscriptions that suggest Christians may have been living in Pompeii even before the eruption of Vesuvius, hiding their faith within the broader pagan population. If confirmed, this discovery would revolutionize our understanding of early Christian history in the region. It would suggest that the post-eruption Christian community wasn't created by refugees seeking shelter in the ruins, but by survivors who had been practicing their faith in secret for decades before the catastrophe struck. The volcanic burial of the city may have provided them with an opportunity to practice their religion openly for the first time. The deeper chambers contain what appears to be a primitive church hidden within what looks like a typical Roman house. The architectural modifications are subtle, but unmistakable to trained archaeologists. Walls have been altered to create a central gathering space, while small chambers around the periphery appear to have served specialized liturgical functions. The Christians of pre-eruption Pompeii had created a house church that could function in plain sight within Roman society. Artifacts found in these deeper levels include what may be some of the earliest Christian art ever discovered. Simple fish symbols carved into wall plaster, bread and wine vessels with Christian inscriptions, and what appears to be a primitive baptismal font all suggest a community that was developing distinctively Christian practices, even while maintaining the outward appearance of Roman conformity. The theological significance of this discovery cannot be overstated. If Christians were practicing their faith in Pompeii before the eruption, it suggests that the city's destruction may have been interpreted by survivors not as divine judgment against paganism, but as a test of faith that they had successfully endured. The volcanic catastrophe becomes not the beginning of their story, but a crucial chapter in a much longer narrative of Christian survival and growth. This interpretation transforms the entire meaning of the post-eruption Christian community. Rather than seeing them as refugees who found sanctuary in the ruins, we must now understand them as survivors who interpreted their preservation as a divine mandate to create something new and unprecedented. They weren't hiding from persecution. They were building the kingdom of heaven on earth, using the preserved ruins of the pagan world as their foundation. The evidence suggests that this interpretation gave the Pompeii Christians a unique sense of mission and purpose that attracted believers from throughout the empire. They saw themselves as living proof that God could preserve his people even in the midst of the most complete destruction. Their very existence in the buried city was a testament to divine power and providence that inspired Christians facing persecution elsewhere. The influence of this theological interpretation can be traced in Christian writings from across the Mediterranean world. References to believers who dwell among the dead, who find life in places of death, who see resurrection and destruction, all begin to make sense when viewed through the lens of what was happening in buried Pompeii. The community's unique experience was shaping Christian thought and practice far beyond the boundaries of the city itself. Perhaps most remarkably, the evidence suggests that the Christians of Pompeii maintained their community and their mission for several centuries, adapting to changing political and religious circumstances while never abandoning their core identity as witnesses to God's power over death and destruction. They created something that was simultaneously deeply rooted in a specific place and time, yet universal in its appeal and significance. The final abandonment of the underground complex sometime in the late imperial period may have marked the end of the Pompeii Christian community, but their influence continued to shape Christian thought and practice long after their departure. The innovations they developed in theology, art, architecture, and community organization can be traced in Christian communities throughout the medieval world and beyond. Their legacy reminds us that the relationship between catastrophe and faith, between destruction and renewal, between judgment and mercy, is far more complex than traditional interpretations have acknowledged. The Christians of buried Pompeii understood something that has often been lost in later theological reflection. They recognized that God's power is revealed not just in preventing disaster, but in bringing good out of evil, life out of death, hope out of despair. Their story challenges us to look beyond the surface of historical events, to discover the deeper currents of human experience that flow beneath. Sometimes the most important developments in human history happen not in the bright light of public attention, but in the shadows and hidden places where people gather to preserve what matters most. The Christians of Pompeii created their most important works, not despite their isolation and concealment, but because of it. In the end, their remarkable experiment in underground Christian community represents something that transcends the particular circumstances of their time and place. They demonstrated the human capacity to find meaning and purpose in the most unlikely circumstances, to create beauty and truth in the midst of destruction, to build communities of hope and faith even when surrounded by reminders of mortality and loss. Their choice to make their home among the ruins of the ancient world wasn't an act of desperation, but an act of profound faith. They understood that sometimes the most powerful testimony to life comes from those who choose to dwell in the shadow of death. They transformed a monument to ending into a promise of beginning, a symbol of judgment into a testament to grace. The ongoing excavations continue to reveal new aspects of their remarkable story, but already the evidence has begun to reshape our understanding of early Christianity, Roman society, and the complex ways that human communities respond to crisis and catastrophe. The Christians of buried Pompeii have given us a gift that extends far beyond archaeology or history. They have shown us that even in our darkest moments, Even when everything seems lost, the human spirit retains the capacity to create something beautiful and lasting. The evidence from these remarkable discoveries has forced scholars to confront an even more unsettling possibility. What if the traditional understanding of Pompeii's timeline is fundamentally flawed? Recent stratigraphic analysis of the deepest excavation levels has revealed something that challenges the very foundation of Roman chronology in the region. Dr. Elena Rossini, head of chronological studies at the Naples Archaeological Institute, has spent the better part of 3 years analyzing volcanic deposits throughout the Campania region. Her findings suggest that what historians have long considered a single catastrophic event may actually have been a series of smaller eruptions spread across several decades. The implications are staggering. If Vesuvius didn't bury Pompeii in a single day of destruction, then the entire narrative of sudden catastrophe giving way to gradual Christian resettlement becomes far more complex. The volcanic record, when examined through modern geological techniques, reveals multiple distinct layers of ash and pumice that were previously assumed to be from the same eruption. Each layer contains slightly different mineral compositions, suggesting they originated from separate volcanic events spanning roughly 50 years. The Great Burial of Pompeii may not have been a singular moment of divine judgment, but a prolonged process of gradual entombment that allowed for evacuation, return, and adaptation over generations. This extended timeline helps explain many of the puzzling discoveries that have emerged from recent excavations. The sophisticated Christian infrastructure found beneath the city makes far more sense if believers had decades rather than days to plan and construct their underground sanctuary. The diversity of artifacts and the evidence of multiple building phases all align with a community that had time to develop gradually, rather than one that emerged suddenly from catastrophe. Archaeological evidence from the deepest levels supports this revised timeline. Pottery fragments found beneath the earliest Christian layers show clear stylistic evolution over time, suggesting continuous habitation rather than sudden abandonment and resettlement. Tool marks on modified buildings indicate systematic renovation projects that would have required months or years to complete. Most tellingly, the distribution of everyday objects throughout various strata suggests people were living normal lives between volcanic episodes, not simply surviving in emergency conditions. The theological implications of this discovery are profound. If the Christians of Pompeii had time to prepare for and adapt to the volcanic threat, their decision to remain in the city takes on entirely different meanings. Rather than being surprised survivors making the best of a desperate situation, they become deliberate colonists who chose to build their community in a place they knew was dangerous, but also uniquely suited to their spiritual purposes. This interpretation finds support in fragmentary texts discovered in the deepest archives of the underground complex. One document, written in elegant Latin script, appears to be a letter from a Christian leader in Rome discussing the theological significance of choosing to dwell in a place marked by divine judgment. The author argues that by making their home in Pompeii, believers were demonstrating their faith in God's power to bring life from death and to transform places of judgment into sanctuaries of grace. The letter references specific scriptural passages about God's people dwelling safely in dangerous places, protected by divine providence from the threats that destroy the wicked. The author seems to view Pompeii not as a place to flee from, but as a place specifically chosen by God for the protection and development of His faithful people. The volcanic activity becomes not a threat to be escaped, but a sign of divine presence to be embraced. This theological framework helps explain the remarkable durability of the Pompeii Christian community. They weren't simply adapting to circumstances beyond their control. They were actively choosing to remain in a place that others considered cursed, believing that their faith made them uniquely suited to thrive where others could only perish. Their persistence through multiple volcanic episodes becomes a testament to their theological conviction rather than merely their practical adaptability. Recent excavations in previously unexplored sections of the underground complex have revealed additional evidence of this deliberate theological choice. Chambers decorated with frescoes depicting biblical scenes of divine protection in dangerous places suggest that the community regularly celebrated their unique situation. Images of Daniel in the lion's den, Shadrach in the fiery furnace, and Noah in the flood all appear alongside local imagery of volcanic activity and preservation. One particularly striking fresco appears to depict the biblical story of Lot's escape from Sodom and Gomorrah, but with a crucial difference. Instead of fleeing the burning city, the righteous figures in the Pompeii version are shown remaining within it, protected by divine light while fire rains down around them. The message is unmistakable. The Christians of Pompeii saw themselves as chosen to remain in a place of judgment, demonstrating God's power to preserve his people even in the midst of destruction. The artistic sophistication of these frescoes rivals anything found in the great churches of Rome or Constantinople. The painters who created them had access to the finest pigments and possessed technical skills that placed them among the master artists of their age. This wasn't folk art created by desperate refugees. These were masterworks commissioned by a community with significant resources and sophisticated aesthetic sensibilities. Chemical analysis of the pigments used in these frescoes has revealed another surprising detail about the Pompeii Christian community. Many of the colors were created using volcanic minerals found only in the immediate vicinity of Vesuvius. Rather than importing traditional artistic materials from distant quarries, the Christian artists were literally incorporating the volcanic environment into their sacred art. They were transforming the very substance of destruction into instruments of beauty and worship. This practice of using local volcanic materials in religious art appears to have been unique to the Pompeii Christian community. Similar pigments don't appear in Christian art from other parts of the empire, suggesting that this was a distinctive local innovation. The artists weren't just adapting to their environment, they were sacramentalizing it, turning the volcanic landscape into a medium for expressing their faith. The theological implications extend beyond art into fundamental questions about the relationship between place and faith. Most early Christian communities sought to distance themselves from pagan associations and dangerous environments. The Christians of Pompeii took the opposite approach, deliberately embracing a landscape that others considered cursed and transforming it into a sacred space through their presence and their art. This radical approach to place and space may have influenced Christian thought far beyond Pompeii itself. References in early Christian writings to the sanctification of dangerous places, the transformation of sites of judgment into sanctuaries of grace, and the power of faith to change the very nature of physical environments all take on new meaning when viewed through the lens of what was happening in the buried city. Recent analysis of burial practices throughout the underground complex has revealed yet another dimension of the community's unique theological approach. Bodies found in the Christian sections show evidence of having been prepared for burial using techniques that incorporated volcanic ash into the preservation process. Rather than avoiding contamination with the substance that had destroyed the pagan city, the Christians were deliberately using it in their sacred rituals. This practice appears to have been based on a sophisticated understanding of both practical preservation techniques and theological symbolism. The volcanic ash helped preserve the bodies of the faithful while serving as a constant reminder of their community's unique relationship with divine judgment and mercy. They were literally incorporating the substance of destruction into their hope for resurrection. The burial chambers themselves reveal careful attention to both practical and symbolic considerations. Bodies were oriented to face east, toward the rising sun and the expected direction of Christ's second coming. But they were also positioned to face the crater of Vesuvius, as if the dead were keeping watch over the mountain that had both threatened and protected their community. The message seems clear. Even in death, the Christians of Pompeii maintained their unique role as witnesses to God's power over natural disaster. Archaeological evidence suggests that these burial practices continued for several generations, with families maintaining their distinctive traditions, even as the broader Christian world developed different approaches to death and burial. The community's theological interpretation of their environment proved remarkably durable, passing from parents to children as both practical knowledge and sacred tradition. The most recent excavations have uncovered what may be the final chapter in the remarkable story of Christian Pompeii. In chambers that appear to date to the 4th or 5th centuries, archaeologists have found evidence of a gradual but deliberate abandonment of the underground complex. Rather than fleeing in panic or being driven out by force, the community appears to have made a careful, organized decision to end their centuries-long experiment in volcanic Christianity. Artifacts found in these final chambers include carefully packed religious objects, sealed containers of important documents, and what appears to be a comprehensive inventory of the community's possessions and achievements. The Christians of Pompeii weren't abandoning their heritage. They were preserving it for future discovery, creating what amounts to a time capsule of their remarkable theological and cultural innovations. One of the most poignant discoveries from this final period is a letter, written in multiple languages and sealed with wax, that appears to be addressed to future generations of believers. The fragmentary text that has been deciphered speaks of a community that accomplished its divine mission and was ready to carry its witness to new places and new challenges. The authors express confidence that their innovations in Christian thought and practice would continue to influence the broader church long after their particular experiment had ended. The letter references specific theological and artistic innovations that the community was particularly proud of, including their unique approach to incorporating natural disaster into Christian worship and their success in creating a truly multicultural Christian society. They seem to have understood that their greatest contribution to Christian history wasn't their survival in a dangerous place, but their demonstration that Christian faith could transform any environment, no matter how hostile, into a sanctuary of divine grace. The final lines of the letter, written in elegant Greek script, contain what appears to be a prophetic statement about the future discovery of their community. The authors express confidence that when the time is right, when the broader Christian world is ready to understand their message, their story will emerge from the volcanic darkness that has protected it. They seem to have anticipated that their greatest influence would come not during their lifetime, but in some future age when their radical approach to faith and place would find new relevance. This prophetic confidence appears to have been justified. The discoveries emerging from buried Pompeii are forcing contemporary Christians to reconsider fundamental assumptions about the relationship between faith and adversity, between divine judgment and divine mercy, between destruction and renewal. The theological innovations developed in the shadow of Vesuvius are speaking to modern believers facing their own forms of catastrophe and displacement. Perhaps most remarkably, the story of Christian Pompeii demonstrates that some of humanity's greatest achievements emerge not in spite of impossible circumstances, but because of them. The community that flourished beneath the volcanic ash created art, architecture, literature, and theological insights that might never have emerged in more comfortable circumstances. They prove that limitation can become liberation, that constraint can become creativity, that even apparent defeat can become victory. Their legacy challenges every assumption about the relationship between security and spiritual growth, between prosperity and faithful witness, between earthly success and divine approval. The Christians who chose to make their home in the ruins of the ancient world created something that transcends both the particular circumstances of their time and the universal human experience of loss and renewal. The ongoing excavations continue to reveal new dimensions of their remarkable story, but already the evidence has begun to reshape our understanding of what it means to be faithful in the face of catastrophe. The Christians of Pompeii have given us more than archaeological treasures or historical insights. They have provided a living example of how human beings can find hope in hopelessness, create beauty in the midst of destruction, and discover the presence of the divine in the most unlikely places. Their choice to dwell among the ruins of the ancient world wasn't an act of desperation or defeat. It was an act of profound theological conviction, a demonstration that faith can transform any environment into sacred space. They understood that sometimes the most powerful testimony to life comes from those who choose to make their home in the shadow of death, who see in apparent endings the promise of new beginnings. The volcanic ash that preserved their city also preserved their witness, creating a testament to human resilience and divine grace that speaks across the centuries to anyone facing their own forms of catastrophe and loss. The Christians of buried Pompeii remind us that even in our darkest moments, even when everything familiar has been destroyed, the human spirit retains the capacity to create something beautiful, meaningful, and lasting. In the end, their story suggests that the relationship between destruction and renewal, between judgment and mercy, between ending and beginning, is far more complex and hopeful than we often imagine. They transformed a monument to catastrophe into a testament to faith, a symbol of divine wrath into a sanctuary of divine grace. They proved that with enough courage and conviction, any place can become holy ground, any ending can become a beginning, any burial can become a resurrection. The most startling revelation has emerged from what archaeologists are calling the Archive of Last Things. Deep within the final chambers of the Christian complex, excavators discovered a collection of documents that appears to chronicle the community's theological evolution over nearly 4 centuries of underground existence. These weren't random papers scattered by abandonment, but carefully curated records that suggest the Christians of buried Pompeii understood they were participating in something historically unprecedented. Among these documents, one text stands out with particular force. Written in multiple scripts and languages, it appears to be a theological treatise on what the author calls the doctrine of sacred burial. The fragmentary Latin portions that have been translated reveal a sophisticated argument that God sometimes preserves his people not by delivering them from catastrophe, but by hiding them within it until the proper time for revelation arrives. The author argues that just as Christ himself was buried before resurrection, entire communities of believers might be called to undergo a kind of communal burial that serves divine purposes beyond their understanding. The volcanic entombment of Pompeii becomes, in this interpretation, not a punishment or accident, but a deliberate act of divine preservation. The Christians weren't surviving in spite of the disaster, but because of it. This theological framework helps explain the remarkable consistency of the community's mission across multiple generations. Each successive group of believers understood themselves as participating in a divine experiment that required their faithful stewardship until its ultimate purpose could be revealed. They weren't simply living in the ruins of the past. They were preparing something for the future. Recent analysis of the final inventory documents has revealed the scope of what they believed they were preserving. Lists written in careful Latin script catalog thousands of manuscripts, hundreds of artistic works, and detailed records of theological innovations developed during their centuries of underground existence. They had created what amounts to an alternate history of early Christianity, one that developed in isolation from the political and cultural pressures that shaped the mainstream church. Perhaps most remarkably, the inventory includes references to documents that claim to record direct continuity with the apostolic age. The community apparently possessed what they believed to be original letters from apostolic figures, copies of Gospels made within decades of their composition, and theological treatises that provided unbroken links to the earliest Christian communities. If authentic, these materials would represent the most significant discovery in the history of Christian archaeology. The implications extend far beyond academic scholarship into fundamental questions about authority and authenticity in Christian tradition. The mainstream church developed its understanding of apostolic succession through institutional continuity and hierarchical transmission. The Christians of Pompeii appear to have maintained their connection to Christian origins through textual preservation and theological consistency. They created an alternative model of Christian authenticity that relied on faithful stewardship rather than institutional authority. This alternative approach to Christian tradition may help explain why the community attracted believers from across the Mediterranean world for so many centuries. People weren't just seeking refuge from persecution or political instability. They were seeking access to forms of Christian knowledge and practice that weren't available anywhere else in the ancient world. The most recent excavations have uncovered evidence that this seeking wasn't one-directional. The Christians of Pompeii appear to have sent emissaries and teachers throughout the Mediterranean world, carrying their unique theological insights to other Christian communities. References in the archive documents describe missionary journeys to North Africa, Asia Minor, and even Britain. The buried city served not just as a repository of Christian tradition, but as an active center for Christian mission and education. Archaeological evidence supports these documentary claims. Artifacts found in Christian sites throughout the former Roman Empire show clear stylistic and theological connections to innovations first developed in buried Pompeii. The community's influence on early Christian development was far greater than their hidden location might suggest. They were operating a kind of underground university whose graduates carried their teachings across the known world. The scope of this influence becomes even more remarkable when considered alongside the community's deliberate isolation from mainstream Christian institutional development. While the broader church was becoming increasingly hierarchical and politically connected, the Christians beneath Pompeii's ruins maintained forms of community organization that emphasized equality, inclusion, and theological experimentation. They created an alternative model of Christian life that may have influenced reform movements throughout Christian history. The discoveries beneath Pompeii's volcanic shroud continue to challenge everything we thought we knew about faith, catastrophe, and the mysterious ways that history preserves its most important lessons. These Christians who chose to dwell among the ruins didn't simply survive disaster. They transformed it into something sacred, proving that sometimes the most profound testimonies emerge from the deepest darkness. Their legacy forces us to reconsider not just the past, but how we face our own moments of crisis and renewal. Maybe Pompeii wasn't buried to be forgotten, but to be remembered when we were ready to listen.